When the Berlin Wall was erected, it didn't just split Berlin above ground, it also split Berlin below ground. Berlin's U- and S-Bahn lines, which had been constructed well before the concept of an East and West Berlin, were also split by the wall. For most of the lines of the U-Bahn in the east, the new status quo was fairly simple. The line simply stopped where before it had continued into the west. This was expedited by the fact that the U-Bahn had been operated by two different companies, BVG West and BVG Ost. But because the U- and S-Bahns did not take into account the Cold War, parts of them began in the west, traveled to the east, and then back into the west. Indeed, announcements were frequently made before the trains traveled into each sector, and signs posted at the stations announced this. Because each train ran freely into each sector, they were prime avenues of propaganda posted at stations and on trains. But with the wall and thus a hard border in place, these lines posed an inconvenient problem. The inelegant solution was that the trains could continue rolling, just not stop. Thus developed the Geisterbahnhöfe, ghost stations. These were stations in which trains from the west still ran, but nobody was allowed off. You would think they would be an amazing means to escape from East Germany or even for espionage purposes, but outside of some isolated incidents, they weren't. Security at these stations were paramount to prevent possible escape attempts at what could have been one of the softest holes in the wall. The stations from the outside were sometimes obvious, sometimes not, but the formerly public entrances were bricked up. After reunification, it was seen that people had tried to knock down the literal walls at places like Potsdamer Platz station. People did attempt to escape through the tunnels, only to discover East Germany had put systems in place to prevent this. A 1966 attempt had managed to break through the brick barriers and almost made it to the west before being apprehended by border guards. Despite making it almost all the way, what had alerted the border guards to the escape were pressure pads on the ground designed to alert guards to this exact situation. Much like the Berlin Wall itself, the ghost stations evolved throughout their existence to cut down on the amount of successful escape attempts. In the most secured areas, they were designed as such. Tightly guarded and controlled entrances went directly into guard stations. Trains entering the stations would pass through light barriers to detect movement, gates that could be closed at a moment's notice, guard towers, more light barriers, and then finally leave the station. Meanwhile, emergency exits were padlocked or welded closed, platforms bricked up, spikes added to platforms, and the only way to leave was via permission of East German border guards, notoriously so happy to assist. The stations themselves, in addition to being used as storage, also became suspended in time. Shortly after the wall fell, photographers found advertisements and Stasi propaganda in the stations that dated all the way back to the 1950s. The S-Bahn in West Berlin had an additional wrinkle. It wasn't operated by West Berlin. It was operated by East Germany. The U-Bahns in the Berlins were operated by separate entities. But the goofily complex agreements and treaties that often predated the Cold War gave control over the entire Deutsche Reichsbahn to East Germany. And then the wall came. And with it, the S-Bahn became two separate systems, with the exception of a singular station, Friedrichstraße, which acted as a border checkpoint. Because this was one of the few stations where West and East could intermingle, it gave it the ability to be used in espionage. Evidence from the Stasi's archives shows that it was often used to pass material between the two Berlins. But even though East Germany controlled the S-Bahn, that doesn't mean it stopped operating in West Berlin. Maps put out by the Deutsche Reichsbahn fully incorporated both sections of Berlin into the plan, despite the very real nature that the tracks had literally been severed and those in the east couldn't access them. But in addition to the Western system being a colossal drain on East Germany's resources, it is speculated that the only reason it was kept was because of the treaties and agreements signed between the Cold War went cold. If they abandoned the literal name of the company used in the agreements, it might unravel the rest of them. It wasn't popular in the West, not just because it was subject to random service disruptions and was treated like the massive drain in resources that it was, but because it was seen as directly supporting East Germany. Because, well, it did. By the 1980s, this had reached a breaking point, and by 1984, an agreement was reached between West Berlin and the Deutsche Reichsbahn. West Berlin would assume operational control over the West Berlin S-Bahn, which then became immediately memory holed off of the East Berlin S-Bahn maps. But the system persisted, and the weird status quo was maintained as well as it could until the wall fell in 1989. Maps made by the West would still display the stations, often with their old names and not what East Germany had renamed them, while maps made by the East could get creative in showing the West. Shortly after reunification, the ghost stations started to reopen, and by 3 March 1992, all were. But as of 2023, not all have remained open. The Französische station was closed in 2020, being replaced by a new line. The stations truly are no longer moments suspended in time.